Today, we're going to be talking about how to enhance your intelligence. And this has a lot to do with your success in life. Psychologists tell us that the job that you get out of college is directly related to your IQ. And there's a lot of other things directly related to your IQ, including how long you live. In fact, in the new scientific studies, they're now having to put that in there. In fact, just last week, a study was done and published in the journal Circulation showing that IQ was the second most important factor to how long you're going to live, over another lifestyle factor that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So intelligence is related also to longevity and how long your success will be. What is the definition of IQ? It's your capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. All three of those things. And it's not just your capacity to learn. You have to retain it. That means you have to have a memory. The temporal lobe of the brain has to be working. And you also have to be able to apply that knowledge in your daily life. And it's often measured by an IQ test. How many of you have had an IQ test in this room? Wow, I would say the majority of Australians have not had their IQ measured. And I'm wondering why. I won't go into the possibilities as to why you haven't had yours measured. It's related somewhat to academic performance. Not completely. There is something called EQ, emotional intelligence, that's also very much related to academic performance, and that has to do with motivation. Motivation is separate from IQ. But if you have motivation and you have IQ, it's very directly related to your GPA or your academic performance. Now, there are some myths about IQ that need to be cleared up here today in this subject about intelligence. One of the myths is genetics that is all that matters. Now, we do know genetics is important. And it is clear that if your mother and father had high IQ, there's a greater chance that you'll have it. But it's not at all this sole determinant of IQ. Another myth is there's nothing you can do about it after age 18. And one of the reasons why that myth is perpetuated is many 18-year-olds in America have had their IQ measured. Normally you have it measured your junior or senior year of high school. And then they will, out of curiosity, try to measure it after age 30 because they've learned so much, they're just sure that their IQ has improved. And then when they take the IQ test, they find out it's the same in most instances. It's the same not because we're not measuring knowledge. Yes, that 30-year-old has accumulated a lot of knowledge, but it's not just accumulated knowledge. We're measuring the capacity to learn, retain, and apply new knowledge. And 30-year-olds often don't have that much greater than what they did at age 18. However, there are significant exceptions. I remember a young man who actually came in to understanding the full message of the Bible as a result of health in our town of Ardmore, Oklahoma. He came in with a vegetarian restaurant there and inquired more about the truths of God. He was interested in his personal health, and he adopted that lifestyle, the vegetarian lifestyle, and then he ended up becoming a fully baptized member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But he had an issue, and part of his issue was IQ. Nice-looking man, tall, handsome, great personality, but he did not do well in school. He had learned enough to learn the gospel and accept that, but he had a desire to really excel. And I remember talking to him as he was coming to me, wondering how he could excel more in school. And I told him, maybe first you ought to go to a place like Mission College where you can learn more of the deep truths of the Word of God. And he did that. He went there for 6 months, and he enjoyed his time there. But I remember calling the director of that school, Louis Torres, about halfway through the course, and I said, tell me how Les is doing. He says, I'm not sure he's going to make it. He is struggling. And he's got getting some of the lowest grades in our classes, but he's barely surviving. And he says, I'm hoping that he's going to pull through. And at the end, he did pull through. He actually raised his grades enough. He wasn't by any means in the top half of his class. He was in the bottom half of his class at Mission College. But he learned enough to become a Bible worker. And he went right into Bible work in Colorado. And he was a successful Bible worker. He had that winning personality and that nice appearance that went along with it, and that helped to make up maybe for some of the deficits that he had as far as his IQ was concerned. But I remember about a year after being in Bible work, he came back to me in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and he says, you know, what I'd really like to do is to incorporate the health message with the gospel full time. I'd really like to become a doctor. And I'm thinking, Les, there's no way. There is no way. I mean, in America, I don't know how it is in Australia, but on those who try to become doctors, less than 2% will actually make it in the medical school. And so you have to have a certain IQ to even be able to withstand that because of all of the information that is thrown at you in a 4-year time period that you have to learn. But he says, you know, I really have that desire. So I told him, well, listen to this. I gave him a presentation that I'm about ready to give you. And I said, incorporate it and really work on it for about a year. And I wasn't sure if it was going to be successful or not, but he had that desire, and I didn't want to say no to that desire. And so he incorporated it. He followed every aspect of the message. And then he went into the pre-med part of things, where he took chemistry and biology and physics. And at first it was a little rough, but then he started to excel more and more. And then he took his MCAT, and now he is in medical school. He made it, the top 2%. And he's having a good time in medical school. So it's a myth that there's nothing that you can do after age 18, because he was over 20 by the time he first came into the message. Another myth, people that are highly intelligent are generally irritating to be around. That has actually been studied, and the studies show that although some of them are irritating to be around, they're no more likely to be irritable than people of low IQ or average IQ. So irritableness has a lot more to do with EQ than IQ, and they're not necessarily related. Another myth, people that are highly intelligent lack common sense. And this, of course, is true in some. Albert Einstein, I think, was a good example, and that's maybe how the myth was perpetuated. Albert Einstein would frequently get lost on his way home. And he would just forget about where he was at. He was deep in thought, and then he'd have to say, wait a minute, where am I? I just passed my house some time ago. And he would have to find it again. And then another myth, you can't improve it, so I try. I think we've already dispelled that myth because it can be improved upon. So let's talk about how to improve intelligence in children and in adults. Now, what I'm going to be presenting to you are things that you can do now to improve your intelligence. And, we have limited time. One of the things I would like to talk about is how you can raise your kids to be high IQ. There is an environment that's actually started in the prenatal and the natal influences, and then the first 5 years of life that are critically important to how high an IQ your own children will have. But that's a different topic, somewhat related, but it is a different topic. But that will be for another time. One is to avoid toxins. Toxins to the brain will adversely affect IQ. And alcohol actually affects a certain portion of the brain before it affects any other portion of the brain. It's called the frontal lobe of the brain. This is the area of spirituality, morality, and the will. It's the area where we make our decisions. It's the judgment area of the brain, the analytical portion of the brain. And when alcohol is on board, in fact, in Australia, the legal limit of alcohol intoxication is 0.05%. And I know you have a major problem with this in this country. because I was leaving the airport. I came into Sydney the first time on Sunday night, and the taxi driver picked me up, and the police had made a line out of the airport measuring everyone that came out and having them blow into a machine to make sure alcohol wasn't on board. Everyone had to blow before they could go. And this taxi driver fortunately passed the test. I was glad to see that. But studies show that if you're at 0.05% and a policeman pulls you over and you're right at that legal limit, will you be able to walk a straight line? You actually will. You can walk a straight line. In fact, if you're skilled at doing so, you can hit a curveball out of a baseball park at that limit. So why is it then that you're 10 times as likely to get into an automobile accident? It's not your coordination. Your cerebellum is working fine. The problem is your judgment. And that's what happened to Princess Di's driver. No one recognized that he was drunk. He was walking straight lines. He was conversing normally. But he attempted to negotiate a turn in a tunnel at a speed that was impossible to negotiate. That wreck has been analyzed, and it's been found that the best race car driver in the world would not have been able to successfully negotiate that turn at that speed. And thus he lost his life and others lost their life as well. Now once alcohol is out of the system, the next day you're able to drive again. Does driving involve critical, abstract, difficult decision making? No. If it did, 16-year-olds would not be allowed to drive in the world. The reason why 16 and 18 and 20-year-olds can drive is because it's a fairly simplistic thing. It doesn't require a lot of complex thinking and analysis. But studies show once alcohol is on board, it takes 2 weeks for critical abstract thinking to come back. One of the reasons why it's best to totally abstain from alcohol so that the frontal lobe can be in tip-top shape. Another substance that affects the frontal lobe of the brain in a more subtle area is nicotine, but it's clear nicotine has a suppressant effect on the frontal lobe of the brain. Lead also is a toxin that affects IQ, one of the reasons why you don't want to have your kids play with toys that are laced with lead. And the most commonly consumed drug in Australia also has a role to play. Anyone want to guess what it is? Caffeine. Caffeine actually affects the adenosine receptors in the frontal lobe of the brain, blocks the adenosine receptors. It also has too much of another chemical, acetylcholine, available. Acetylcholine, actually what it does is destroys the enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which makes too much acetylcholine available. And this is why people under the influence of caffeine feel stimulated. Pavlov studied this out. Typists actually can type a little bit faster under the influence of caffeine, but they make 10 times as many errors. And recently there was a study done on caffeine and gossip. Now, the definition of gossip that was used in this study was sharing private information with someone who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem. And studies show when you have caffeine on board, you're significantly more likely to do that than when you don't have caffeine on board. And that's simply due to that loss of brake in the frontal lobe of the brain that comes from blocking those adenosine receptors. Now, this information is caught up with the National Football League. In America, we just had the biggest, most watched sporting event of the year, the Super Bowl, occur. And interestingly, those linemen and those blockers, the one trying to protect the quarterback as well as the ones that are trying to get to the quarterback,